Hello, welcome back to Learn Economia. Today we are going to discuss the concept of green GDP. So let's have a detailed discussion on the same. Before going to see what is called green GDP, it's very important to understand what is the idea of GDP. So to start with, we will first of all explain what is GDP and then gradually we proceed to the concept of green GDP. Now coming to GDP, as per IMF or International Monetary Fund, we could find that the GDP is something that measures the monetary value of final goods and services, that is, those that are brought by the final user produced in a country in a given period of time, say a quarter or a year. It counts all of the output generated within the borders of a country. So, we are talking about GDP, which is the gross domestic product, isn't it? GDP stands for the gross domestic product. Now we could find that as far as this particular word GDP is concerned, or the gross domestic product is concerned, we are having certain complex ideas here. So first complex idea here is gross. So what is it all about gross? So gross means we are talking about net plus depreciation. Net plus depreciation. So we are adding the depreciation element here. And that is how we are dealing with the gross idea here. Now, we do have something called domestic. What is it all about domestic? So domestic means within the borders. So whatever is happening within the political borders of country, this is what is being taken. So when we say gross domestic product, we are adding the element of depreciation along with the net aspect, and that is why we are getting the gross. And when we say domestic, it is something which is different from the national product. Whenever we say domestic product, it is different from national product, because when we consider domestic case, we are just considering whatever is happening within the borders, within the political borders of a country. So that is why we say that we are looking on to the generation of output that happens within the borders of a country. Okay, something which happens outside the borders is not taken into consideration here. We are just considering what is happening inside the political boundary of a country. Again, we are having a particular duration for which GDP is calculated. So most often what happens is that we go for a quarter or a year or something. So this is how things happen. So again, we go for the final goods and services. Final goods and services. The monetary value of final goods and services. So the money value of final goods means we are not considering the intermediate products here. We are not looking on to the products that will be entering into the next stage of production. So that is not taken. Instead, those goods which are used for the final consumption, that is being taken here. So that is called the final goods. Okay, the goods and services which are used for final consumption. So this is the basic idea of what is called our normal GDP. Okay, now what is the implication of GDP? We know that GDP is a very traditional metric, isn't it? So we think that whenever we have GDP, we will have some kind of signal regarding the performance of economy. So GDP will help us to know about how the economy is performing. So if we have a high GDP, we will consider that, okay, the health of the economy is very good. It's fine because the economy is moving well and good. And if we are having a very less GDP, that means that the health of the economy is very bad. So this is how we usually try to understand the idea of GDP. We know that it's a figure, right? It's a figure which talks a lot regarding the economic performance of a nation. Now I'm taking you to some data. It's actually time series data that we are looking onto. This is a trend analysis. So this trend of GDP is actually generated by IMF, International Monetary Fund again. So what you are seeing here is a part of IMF data mapper. So as per this, when we look onto the real GDP growth of India in terms of annual percentage change, we could find that from 1980 to 2025. This is what we are considering, 1980 to 2024-25 period. we could have a lot much of fluctuations in the GDP growth of our country. So what is happening? You could find that during this 1990 period, we had a very big dip that was happening. Why? Because by the end of 1980s and all, we were having some very bad problematic scenario in the country. So we were having a BOP crisis. So this was a period of BOP crisis, and then then we went for reforms. We were introducing structural reforms in our country, and that made our country to have a recovery. So that is what you are seeing here. So this is the scenario BOP crisis. That was why our country was made to have a downfall here. But later, since we have gone for the structural reforms in our country in the form of LPG, we could have a recovery. So that is what you are seeing here. Again, what happened again in between also we could have some fluctuations that was happening. But again, when you come to this period, the fluctuation and the dip was very, very deep. Like if you consider the downfall was something very much remarkable. Why? So this was something related to the 2008 crisis. The 2008 financial crisis, if you remember, it was starting in the US economy. This financial crisis was happening. It was starting in the banking sector of the US economy, but soon it was spreading to different other countries and affecting almost all the sectors. Then we were going for some fiscal stimulus packages and other kinds of policy measures, which made our country to revive. Okay, so that is what all about the story of the dip that happened in 2008 and the kind of recovery that we could have afterwards. Now, so we could have a very severe dip during this period, the 2020 19-20 period. So actually, this is the 2019-20 period. Why? So again, this is due to the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic was it was actually gripping the entire world, and for the same reason, India was not an exception. India was also having the crisis, and we were having a closed down situation. We were having a lockdown here, and for the same reason, every production units were shut. Every production units were locked down. Some factories were actually closing down forever. Some firms were exiting the market forever, and all. So we could have a very big dip that was during the period of 2019-20 as a result of COVID pandemic affecting all our sectors without any exception. So later what happened was that we went for vaccination drive, we went for some other set of policy measures, etc., etc. So which made our economy to have a recovery. So that is what we are seeing from here onwards. Okay. So we could find that the IMF was actually looking on to India's economy, and it was actually uh, collecting some data, and it was analyzing our economy. And for the same reason, now we could find that in the year 2024-25, in the year 2024-25, the IMF was actually looking on to the GDP of our country. And it was actually earlier it was set as 6.8 percentage. This was the earlier kind of understanding, earlier kind of announcement that IMF was making regarding India with respect to the real GDP growth in terms of the annual percentage change for India. But later, what happened was that in 2024, for 2024-25, RBI was actually upgrading the GDP for India by 20 basis points. Okay, by 20 basis points, this upgradation has been done, and now from 6.8, we could have our GDP to 7%. So it was a revision that IMF was doing with respect to its forecast from the previous estimate of 6.8%, which was done for us, and now we move with the 7% real GDP growth in terms of the annual percentage change. Now I'm taking you to some as more explanation with respect to the GDP aspect. So real GDP we have already explained. This is actually 7% for India for the year 2024-25. And when we consider the GDP per capita with respect to current prices, what happens is that this put as or as it is being estimated as 10.12 thousand. So here we are actually looking onto the purchasing power parity based aspect. We are now considering this in terms of the international dollars per capita. Okay. Now if you look at the inflation rate of India, so what is happening? So when you look at the average consumer prices, we could find that it's being recognized as 4.6% for 2024. So they're having several other figures which are again given here. Since these are the prominent ones to be discussed, I was just telling about the same. Now we are moving on to what is green GDP. So we have understood what is GDP. We have seen that how GDP is having some role in our economy, how it is signaling some idea related to the performance of the economy, etc., etc. We have already seen. Now we need to specifically look onto the exact topic of discussion in today's session, that is called green GDP, isn't it? So as far as GDP is concerned, we could find that it's a very important kind of indicator. It's being widely used as well. But we need to ask a question. So whenever we go for GDP, whenever we go for increase in GDP to enhance our economic performance, to enhance our economic health and all, we go for production, isn't it? So GDP can be increased with production. So when we say about production, production will be happening in agriculture sector, production would be there in industrial sector, production would be there in service sector as well. So all these sectors will be functioning well so as to enhance our GDP. So this, for the same reason, our government will be trying to pressurize or trying to enhance the production of all these sectors to enhance our GDP. Now, just think about this case. So whenever a particular sector enhances, for example, you can take about agriculture or industry. So you are trying to enhance agriculture production. If you are a farmer, you are trying to enhance your production and productivity in your agriculture area. So what could be the measures you will be taking? So you will try to use pesticides because you want to get rid of pest, isn't it? So you are focusing on to enhance your production and productivity. So you will be using pesticides. Again, you need to understand that whenever you use pesticide, it might be causing some kind of pollution. It will be polluting the air. You might be using some fertilizers, isn't it? Because you want to equip your yield. You want to enhance your productivity in your agriculture area. So you are focusing on to yield and productivity, and for the same reason you use different types of pesticides, which would be leading to both soil pollution, water pollution, as well as it might be leading to air pollution in certain instances. So we could find that your intention, you as a farmer, your intention is to enhance the productivity of your agricultural products or agricultural land, but unfortunately, along with increasing production, the efforts that you are taking here to enhance production is leading to some environmental consequences. Mostly it is leading to some bad environmental consequences, isn't it? Again, you can talk about some industrial production. So just think about a factory. A factory is producing some products for satisfying some needs and wants of its people. But unfortunately, the factory would also be polluting the environment in different ways. It might be leading to land pollution, soil pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and whatnot. Isn't it? So these all are some environmental impacts. So environmental impact that comes as a result of production to enhance GDP. So these environmental impact is being not covered. This is not covered when we go for our normal traditional way of GDP calculation. So we are moving for a very new adjustment here, or else we are going for a new method here. We are trying to capture this environmental impact, mostly in terms of negative aspects that we are having in our environment. We are trying to capture this and we are trying to adjust our actual GDP, traditional GDP, by considering this environmental impact. So this is called environmentally adjusted GDP. So this is called environmentally adjusted GDP or the green GDP. So now you might have understood the difference between the normal traditional GDP and the green GDP. Normal traditional GDP is just a metric, just a number that deals with how much production is happening in the economy. This is what our traditional GDP looks at. But when it comes to green GDP also takes into consideration whenever we go for production, what does it impact on the environment. So for the same reason, since it is taking into consideration the role of environment, since it is taking into consideration the impact that we are causing on the environment, it's a very, very holistic kind of measurement of our actual progress in the economy. So when we look at green GDP, you could find that this measure will be looking onto the actual or real progress. Okay, so we consider the cost that we are creating on the nature, the cost that we are creating on the environment. So that kind of bad consequences will be taken into consideration in this attempt of computing green GDP. Now, how can you compute green GDP? How can you calculate green GDP? So the calculation of green GDP is actually something which is theoretically possible. So theoretically possible means if you have the figure of our traditional GDP, if you have this number, you will just go for environmental cost and you just subtract the environmental cost from the traditional GDP. Now, when you do this, you will be getting the green GDP. So this is the theoretical idea of calculating green GDP. Now we will see how this has been possible in reality. How to what extent we can attain this. We will see this. Before that, it's very important to see the features of green GDP. Now we have understood the green GDP concept. Now we will see the features of green GDP. So I was telling that whenever we try to enhance production to enhance our traditional GDP, we will be causing certain depletion. So what happens? We will be depleting natural resources. We will be depleting natural resources for one or the other reasons. So this might not be sometimes deliberate, but it happens whenever we go for production. It happens. For example, we use as much as minerals as possible. We use as much as fossil fuels as possible. So we use more as much as timber as possible and as much as water as possible. So if we are using these resources, it's okay. But what happens if we misuse the same? We misuse the same in many instances. So after taking timber from the available area, what will happen if you go to forest and cut the wood? Forest is something that is meant for animals, plants, birds and other species, isn't it? But you are now, or humans are now going to forest, and actually we are also trying to deplete the resources in the forest area. We are trying to deplete the resources in the ocean area. So what is it all about? We are trying to deplete the nature itself. So this will definitely cause some problems. And for the same reason, it is very, very important to capture all these kind of things whenever we go for the calculation of the GDP. So this is what green GDP is doing. The traditional GDP is not considering all these things, but the green GDP takes all these kinds of impacts and the cost that we are making to environment, all these kinds of negative external effects are being taken, and then we can go for the calculation of green GDP. So green GDP is thus an eco-friendly measure of calculating GDP. I'm not saying that green GDP as such is something eco-friendly, but when we get some idea related to the green GDP of a nation, we will be able to see to what extent a particular nation is creating some harm for the environment. So that could be not. That's it. Again, so it deals with degradation as well. So it measures pollution. It will be looking on how much pollution was happening in the economy as a result of production. It deals with how much of deforestation has been created. It deals with soil erosion. Like what happens is that deforestation itself will lead to soil erosion, isn't it? So you will cut all the trees means there is now no tree available to hold the soil, the top layer of the soil. So it would get washed away. So top level of the soil is being very much enriched with nutrients. For example, humus and all is there in the top level of the soil. But now if it is getting eroded means, or if it is getting washed away means, what happens? Again, it's a loss for the nature, right? So top level of soil is very, very fertile too. But if you are not having any trees or any roots of the trees to hold this soil firmly means, definitely as a result of wind, as a result of water, etc., these would get washed away, and definitely it will be affecting the fertility of plants and all. So all these are again depletion. The traditional GDP won't capture all these kind of things, but green GDP will do. Green GDP will take into consideration all these kinds of degradation that we will be making onto the nature. So for the same reason, again, we could find that this is an eco-friendly measure in that sense. Again, the climate change cost. So why we are very conscious regarding this thing nowadays. So if you actually ask your grandparents and all, they will be saying that okay, in our times we could actually predict the climate, we could actually predict the seasons, we could say that during these months rain would be coming, during these months there would be spring, during these months there would be winter, all these kind of things were in our hand. But now summer can come anytime, winter can come anytime, it's not in our hand. So flood can come anytime, some natural disasters would be happening, some extreme events would be happening. So all these are causing some issues in the economy, isn't it? So why this is happening? So this is happening due to our activities. So we were polluting the environment and we have been polluting the environment. We are trying to use CFC, chlorofluorocarbon. These are actually something we are producing. So we use air conditioners, we use refrigerators, etc. So these would be producing CFCs. So nowadays CFC free refrigerators, air conditioners are available, but still many people are using their old CFC producing electronic appliances. So definitely this will be leading to warming up of the earth atmosphere. Warming up of atmosphere means CFC is being released to the atmosphere and it will be leading to global warming. So when global warming happens, definitely it will lead to rising of sea levels. So this will lead to flood, this will lead to tsunamis, this will lead to issues and so on. Because later on, what happens? So today's global warming, today's more evaporation will lead to tomorrow's flood, isn't it? Now, as a result of more heat and more humidity, more water would get evaporated, and when there is rainy season, more rain will be happening, and this will lead to flood. So now it is drought, and tomorrow it is flood. So some extreme kind of natural events would be happening, which will be again create some problems for the economy. So as a result, definitely there is a requirement to take all these climate change costs into consideration whenever we look on to actual GDP. So this is what green GDP is doing. Green GDP takes into consideration the effect of climate change as well. So that is why that is the main reason why we are able to see that it deals with the climate change cost as well. Again, so since the green GDP deals with depletion, deterioration, destruction, etc., that we are doing in the nature, since it is dealing with the climate change cause, etc., it gives us a more accurate picture regarding the performance of the economy. It deals with a more accurate picture regarding the actual welfare of the population who are living in a particular area, who are living in a particular country. So it deals with actual well-being. Okay, so if you just take a company or a firm, okay, so what happens in the scenario of a usual case? A firm will be having a profit motive because it's rational. So its main intention is to make profit. So while making profit, it might be leading to some pollution. It might be leading to some bad environmental events, isn't it? Because it will be leading to deforestation, it will be leading to pollution, it will be leading to many other environmental bad impacts. But the company, since it is interested in making a high profit only, since it is not taken into consideration the other effects that the bad effects that it's been causing on the environment. As far as the traditional GDP is concerned, the company, its production, its profit, etc., are being taken into consideration. But when we look on to the green GDP, definitely we consider the future cost, the potential future cost. So the company might be neglecting its responsibility of maintaining some standards. For example, it might not be installing some measures or some equipments to actually equipments to enhance some proper kind of guidelines. For example, sometimes the government might be giving some guidelines for the company to install some kind of measures or some kind of mechanisms or equipments for waste treatment. So waste treatment is very, very important. If the company sometimes the company might be installing this equipment for waste treatment, but after some point of time depreciation would be happening, isn't it? So the company's this waste treatment equipment might not be functioning well. In that instance, what will happen if the company is not going for any maintenance cost? What will happen if the company is not replacing the damaged equipment with a new equipment? So these would definitely cause some problems to the environment, isn't it? But GDP, the traditional GDP won't be capturing all these kinds of things. But the green GDP will be considering this, because today, if the company is or if the firm is neglecting its responsibility, means definitely it will be causing some impact on the future generation. So this green GDP captures all these kinds of things. Now, so moving to the merits of green GDP, now you might be very much clear regarding the difference between the traditional GDP and green GDP, isn't it? Now we will be able to understand the merits of green GDP much better. Definitely, it takes environmental valuation into consideration. So you might be knowing that when we learn about environmental economics, we do have various theories dealing with environmental valuation, isn't it? Or is valuation of environmental asset. Like we do have hedonic pricing principle, we do have travel cost principle, etc., etc. But green GDP is again some advanced measure that can be taken into consideration for measuring the environmental degradation. Definitely, that will be something which could be understood when we go for green GDP. The economic value of natural resources is usually being neglected the same, isn't it? The economic value of natural resources is usually neglected. But when we go for green GDP, we capture it. So neglected in the traditional GDP measures, but we capture this in green GDP. Green GDP. So for the same reason, we will be able to understand the true worth of our production. So we will be able to understand true worth of our production, our economic activity. And for the same reason, we will be able to make certain policies with some informed decision. Because I told you that now we do have the traditional GDP metric with us. Now we do have environmental cost with us, and we do have the green GDP with us. So when we have all these, we will be able to know the exact kind of impact, bad impact that our production is creating in our economy, and this will help us to know the kind of consequences that our production is making in our economy, and this will help us to make some policy measures as a result of information that we could get from this. Why we call it as informed decisions? The policy measures would be informed decisions because the policies that we are taking here is being driven by the information that we could get from the calculation of green GDP. That's it. Now, we would be focusing on sustainability here. So when we focus on sustainability, we ensure that the present generation is doing something without compromising for the needs and wants of the future generation. So we will be focusing onto the present generation and to the future generation simultaneously. So this will happen in the scenario of green GDP. So it's a merit because we are considering the environmental factors, we are considering the environmental damage. So this assessment would be identifying the idea of environmental integrity. The green GDP assessment would be as per that only. So we could ensure that whatever we are doing today will not be happening at the cost of the future generation. So that can be something which we can assure. Yes, of course, it will also lead to better decision making, isn't it? So why we are talking about some informed decisions. Now we do have information related to the consequences of our production onto the nature, and we use the same for policy formulation. We implement right kind of policies as a result of our information received from this context, and thus we will be able to have both economic factors and environmental factors taken into consideration simultaneously to build our policies. And this kind of policy will be leading to our development. But never think that green GDP is free from limitations. Definitely there exists a lot many disadvantages and demerits for green GDP. So what is the main problem? Definitely there exists a problem of valuation. You say that we will be having environmental cost and we will be subtracting environmental cost from our traditional GDP metric and we arrive at green GDP. But how would you be able to value the environmental cost? Is it possible to value the environmental cost? So sometimes I might be a person who love the nature. So for the same reason, I might attach a high cost to the damage that the environment is having. Somebody might not be caring about the environment. He might be attaching a very low cost there. So it is something very much subjective. It depends on how would you consider environment here, whether you consider environment as something good or bad, or whether you consider environment as something which is very much required or something just little required. So it's a very complex kind of thing. The monetary valuation is something that you can definitely impute, but it will not be capturing the true kind of value. The true value won't be something that you can arrive at, because the cost that you are creating on the environment won't be something that you can capture in terms of a number. And also, you could find that there is no universally accepted method for calculating green GDP. Every country will be coming with certain measure. UN would be coming with its own way of explaining, its own way of method of calculating green GDP. But unfortunately, we do not have a universally accepted unique method to look at the calculation of green GDP. And this is another problem that we are having here. Definitely, these all will be creating some issues when it comes to the valuation of green GDP. What about the data availability? Do you think that every company would be keeping some data on the kind of damage that it is creating on the environment? Do you think that every farmer would be creating some data on the kind of damage he is creating on the environment? No, right? And also, for the same reason, we do not have proper accurate data. So accurate data is not available. So this is something not present or not available. So since we are not having some accurate set of data, how can you consider the calculation of green GDP? Again, it's a problem. Data is unavailable means your basic idea of action of calculating GDP itself is being now harmed, itself is being negatively affected, isn't it? So this is another demerit of dealing with the GDP calculation. Again, there is some standardization issues. Why? I told you that there is no single universally accepted method. No single universally accepted method. Whenever a particular body comes with a particular method, somebody else will come with criticism. Whenever somebody else comes with a particular method of green GDP calculation, somebody else again with some other person will be coming with criticism. So that means every method is having some limitations. For the same reason, there is no proper universally accepted method for calculating green GDP. No single standardized method is available. And for the same reason, how can you make comparison? Even comparison won't be possible. So from here onwards, we are going to see what is the role of India in this green GDP calculation efforts. To be very specific, we do not have any official metric for green GDP calculation, but we have taken several methods to ensure that whatever actions that we are taking here is in accordance with the preservation of environment, is in accordance with the conservation of environment. So RBI was actually looking onto the green aspect related to GDP of our country, the green aspect related to the production of our country, and RBI was actually able to identify that if you go for green GDP calculation, and when we compare our green GDP with our traditional GDP, okay, when we compare these two things, the green GDP would be, this would be 10% lower than the actual GDP, because that much kind of effects, bad effects are being created in our country as a result of our production. But we have taken several measures and methods to enhance clean energy, to enhance the conservation of resources, to enhance reduction in pollution, etc., etc. So these are certain methods taken by India to enhance our role of protecting the nature. So that's it. So we have gone for the National Mission for Sustainable Habitat. We have gone for National Action Plan on Climate Change to deal with the climate change as well. Also, we are agreeing with the Paris Agreement commitments. We are dealing with the same. So in that case, these are certain efforts, these are certain steps that India has taken to deal with conservation of nature, to deal with eco-friendly practices, etc., etc. Now, if you look at the Global Green Economy Index ranking for India, you could find that out of the 160 nations, India is having a rank of 60. So this is something that we could have in 2022. This is meant for 2022. Okay. So it shows some progress of India, but again, we have to ensure that we are having several areas to improve. So when we take more measures for improvement, we will be having our green GDP metric more and more closer to our traditional GDP metric. Again, we need to understand that India is still developing. India is an emerging market economy. It is still developing. It is trying to enhance our FDI and all. And for the same reason, there can be chance of high pollution. There can be chance of more environmental depletion, etc. But it is our responsibility to ensure that we are reducing our pollution levels and all. So, in short, we could find that green GDP is actually still developing concept. It is still evolving. It is still evolving. So every day we will be learning about some kind of natural disasters nowadays, and all these are happening as a result of the kind of damage that we had created on the environment someday or the other. So that is why we have to ensure that at least from now onwards we are protecting the nature. So definitely this green GDP measure will take into consideration the kind of depletion and deterioration that we have created in the nature. But that doesn't mean that this green GDP is not having any demerits. Definitely it has got both merits as well as demerits. But whenever we go for green GDP calculation, it will be a very holistic kind of process, because we will be able to know the real economic well-being and the real environmental well-being here. So in this case, we will be taking both economic as well as environmental factors into consideration simultaneously. So for the same reason, it's a very valuable tool. Definitely, we will be able to arrive at a sustainable development scenario if we are making our policies dependent on green GDP. But for the same, we should have some proper green GDP metric, a proper green GDP measure. But unfortunately, we do not have any method to compute the exact environmental cost. So that is the main problem here. So that is it all about today. I hope you could understand the session. Now, you can actually download the Learn Economy app, where you'll be getting the previous year question papers and answers, free study materials, live as well as recorded classes, free MCQ ways, weekly tests and all. So I'll be providing the details on the description box. And also, you can join our free Telegram community. Then you can like, share and subscribe our channel for more videos. Thank you.